Hello, my name is Madison Hanberry from Georgia Tech, and I'll be presenting the paper Black IoT. IoT botnet of high wattage devices can disrupt the power grid. Before we get started, I'd like to make some acknowledgments. The original authors were from Princeton University, and they were Saleh Sultan, Pratik Mittal, H. Vincent Poor, and this was originally presented at the 27th Usenix Security Symposium in Baltimore on August 15th in 2018. If you'd like to read the paper, you can follow that link for more information. So the context of this paper is that a botnet can be used to cripple the power grid because currently we're seeing a rise in IoT devices. And these IoT devices are increasingly being connected to high wattage utilities such as air conditioners, space heaters, air purifiers, etc. You can look at the table on the right to see some of the wattages that are used. And as we've seen in the past with other attacks, IoT devices are increasingly being compromised, and they can be used collectively to increase or decrease demand in a way that is unpredictable. There's a few classes of attacks. The first one that we're going to speak about is attacks that result in frequency instability. As alluded to previously, a lot of devices connected in a botnet could abruptly change the demand of an electric power grid, and this may cause a critical value to be reached on the power grid that might cause generators to trip, and widespread blackouts would follow. There are many simulations that show that a 30% increase in demand will trip all generators in a system. And to achieve this, only about 90,000 air conditioners or 18,000 electric water heaters would be needed to perform such an attack. This could be verified using the table from our previous slide, seen here. Another class of attack, or another way that such an attack could damage our power grid, is that line failures could result in cascading failures. Now, a little background about this is that generators primarily control and stabilize the frequency of the system after an attack. The flow and power in the grid follows Kirchhoff's laws, which means that a power grid operator doesn't have any control over the flow of electricity once it has left the generator. So even a small increase in demand during this process may cause overloads for the power lines and generators, and if the attacker knows what they're doing, they could even target specific areas within a power grid to cause regional blackouts. Along with this comes a risk of increased operating costs. So, how it works is that if an attacker doesn't necessarily want to create damage to a power grid, they could instead cause the power operator to use more electricity than they had predicted that they would need to generate in the previous time period. The way this might affect operating costs is that whenever a surplus of energy is needed, it is then purchased from a third-party firm. These firms operate solely so that when power grids experience unexpected demand, they can purchase reserve power at an increased cost for an expedited purchase. So an attacker's goal might not necessarily be to cause damage to a system or to incapacitate it in any way, but they might instead desire to make money or profit from the increased use of this existing firm. So to understand a little bit more about this paper, you need to know some basics about how the power grid works and how large power systems operate. So the first thing we need to observe is that there are many components in the power grid. In fact, you can see a broad overview of some of the components in the diagram on the top right. So to start with, electricity is generated at appropriately named generators, then transmitted to transmission or distribution networks. As the name implies, they distribute the electricity. So the most operational challenges take place in transmission networks, and that's because the power grid operator, it doesn't have very much control over the way power is transmitted once it leaves the generators. Now, the transmission network is typically what people will think of when they refer to a power grid, because that makes up all the disparate locations that generators and transformers exist and how they're interconnected. And because of this high interconnectivity, power grids are very complicated and have a complicated topology. So, normal operation of a power grid relies on persistent balance between supply and demand. As alluded to earlier, unexpected supply or demand imbalance can cause numerous classifications of outages. Power system operators rely on historical and weather data to predict demand. That means ahead of time they want to have a general idea of how much power is going to need to be generated so that they have the adequate amount, not too much and not too little, to expend. So, grid operators are structured in such that it can control operation if a component fails. That means that they abide by the law that if they have at least one failure in a major component in the power grid, then they can continue operation normally without any interruptions, without any blackouts. So, that last point where it says demand is inversely related to frequency refers to the fact that as demand increases on a system, the frequency across the entire system decreases. And this is because of Kirchhoff's law and the general laws governing electrical flow. Speaking of flows, what are power flows? Well, first we need to know that transmission lines are used for power delivery. You want to get power from one place to another using transmission lines. Each line has what's called a power flow, and that's just the electricity that's flowing across them. Once again, they're determined by Kirchhoff's laws, and there's a particular capacity that can safely be accommodated on each of these lines. And if the capacity is exceeded, it can be damaged in numerous ways, usually due to heat-related issues. So the voltage of the terminating buses also determines the overall voltage stability. That means that the voltage experienced at the endpoint of a power grid determines whether or not the voltage is going to be consistent across the entire system. So to help maintain the expected voltage level at an endpoint, there's a reactive power supply. Basically, what that does is it maintains the voltage at the endpoint so that there aren't very many fluctuations. So if there is instability, then that means that the power supply at the endpoint cannot regulate the voltage any longer, and a voltage collapse occurs. So once again, the core issue here is that if there's a wide swing in demand or supply of electricity, then a voltage collapse can occur, and that could have an issue that could create many issues within the power system. So, how might an attacker utilize these insufficiencies in a power grid? Well, if they're able to compromise a wide swath of IoT devices that are connected to high power utilities, as seen on the bottom right chart, they'll be able to orchestrate a wide change in supply and demand of electricity, and they'll be able to essentially bring it to its knees or manipulate the power system to their desires. So this class of attacks is defined in this paper as a mad IoT attack. There are a few variations of mad IoT attacks. So a significant frequency change is kind of what's been alluded to all along. That is, a sudden change in demand can affect the frequency of the entire system. Now, disrupting a black start is essentially during the recovery process when a blackout has already been created. The system is going to try to start, but they need to be able to start under stable conditions. And if the conditions continue to fluctuate, the startup procedure will fail and the blackout will be prolonged. Line failures and cascades, again, if there is a threshold that's passed in how much capacity a line can handle, then the line may fail, and that initial failure may cause failures in other parts of the system, and it could cascade to the entire power system with numerous line failures. That would be expensive to repair, difficult to manage. Failures in tie lines is a special type of line failure. There are special lines that tie different regions or different power facilities together. And these are increasingly important because if they are severed, then that means the different regions of a power grid cannot help another one remain stable. And if one is running low on power, then the other can't supply additional power for that system, etc. And then once again, increasing the operating cost can be a desire of an attacker if they will somehow profit from the power grid needing to purchase additional electricity because of unexpected demand. Here are some concrete examples of how mad IoT attacks can occur. So an example of a grid frequency rise and drop could result in generation tripping. So that means that a generator won't operate normally for a period of time. And basically that's just switching on and off all the bots at once to either increase or decrease demand at will. And essentially all of these attacks kind of rely on that kind of pattern. It's just a timing thing. So you want to switch on and off the bots to manipulate demand, but when you do it, can drastically impact the effect it has. So disrupting the grid restart would be if you switched on all the bots while it was attempting to restart from a blackout. And the line failures and cascades would be if you're trying to target a particular geographic region and you create a huge surge in demand in one particular region that a line connects to, then that will increase the amount of voltage going through that line and increase the current going through that line. And the heat would cause a failure. And if these failures persist or they're in critical locations, it could result in number 4, which is a failure in tie lines or cascading failures. And then finally, increasing the operating costs, as we've described before, could occur. So, what do we do to guard against this class of attacks? So the main challenge is that the source of a mad IoT attack is extremely difficult to detect and, for the same reasons, disconnect. And what this means is that since mad IoT attacks rely on a distributed network of devices, you can't shut off one section of the power grid to address the problem. In fact, it's very likely that your adversary is controlling devices that are distributed across the entire power line. So essentially, you'd have to create a blackout to stop the attack that might create a blackout. So it's a circular problem. And moreover, attacks are easy to repeat because once you have connection to those devices, it's difficult to pinpoint what's causing the surge in electricity. So the issue is not going to be mitigated. That means on demand, they'll be able to send a command to all of these devices to increase or decrease the demand at their own schedule. Another detail is that they don't necessarily need to know details about the power grid unless they're doing a targeted attack. So if they have enough devices, it doesn't matter where they're located or what device they're connected to. If they were to just switch on all of the devices and consume as much power as possible, it's essentially guaranteed that they'll have negative effects on the power grid. And they don't need to know anything else. And then finally, power grids aren't designed to defend against mad IoT attacks because when they were initially designed, IoT devices didn't exist, let alone the feasibility of a botnet in general. And now, since those two technologies do exist and they're difficult to track down, it's very difficult to address these issues with a system that was never designed with those threats in mind. So thankfully, mad IoT attacks have not been a problem historically, but we do have some historical blackouts that we can look at to see what such an attack would do to a power grid. And that's because each of these incidents could easily have been caused by a mad IoT attack in general, although historically they haven't been. But it gives us some insight into how they could be handled in the future, or might manifest in the future. So in 2003, energy deficits in Ohio caused blackouts in the US and Canada. It affected multiple regions. And then similarly, in the same year, there was a tie line between Switzerland and Italy, and it shut down the entire Italian grid because it had a line failure. So all it comes down to is that since the power grid operators weren't expecting a change in demand, hence the energy deficit issue in the Ohio incident, it caused huge ramifications for the power grid and everyone connected to it. So, as we've alluded to before, the main objective and the main tool afforded by a mad IoT attack is the ability to change demand, and so this essentially could have the exact same results. So in order to see how a mad IoT attack could be orchestrated and the effects it might have on a particular system, this research team decided to create simulations using MatPower and Power World frameworks. MatPower is a MATLAB library for power simulation across power grids, and Power World is a licensed simulator with the same goal. So the WSCC 9-bus grid model, which you can see a diagram of on the right, it was used to evaluate the frequency within a system before, during, and after a mad IoT attack in multiple scenarios. This was used because it's a widely available standard, and it is a good approximation of what a power grid in the Western world might experience, specifically in the United States and Canada. The Polish grid model is also one of the more documented, publicly used models. So it was also used, but its simulations were centered around evaluating the power flow and how it might be disrupted. So the number of mad IoT bots in a system was represented in a particular metric. It's a percentage, right? And what that percentage represents is the number of bots per megawatt of capacity. And that's for the change in capacity or the change in load on a system. So, all right. So these simulations were used to simulate power disturbances or frequency disturbances within a system. So for the simulation on the right, 200 to 300 bots per megawatt caused sudden generation tripping. So that would obviously affect the ability of a system to maintain stability and generate enough power to meet demand, essentially causing blackouts. So 25% increase, or 25 megawatt increase. Basically, you can see that with low inertia, meaning it did not reach 25 megawatts quickly, resulted in a under frequency generation tripping. So that means the frequency went too low, and the high inertia didn't impact the system as much. Likewise, you see a similar relationship for 30 megawatts, although the troughs in the graph are more extreme. We also wanted to see how a grid restart would be affected. So 100 to 200 bots, significantly less than the previous demonstration, was still able to disrupt a grid restart after a blackout had been caused. So you see the normal restart, the frequency does vary, but not very much. And then you see the red dotted line, which is the threshold of successful restart. And then on the right, the 20 megawatt increase before restart did impact the restart capability. In fact, it was not able to have a successful restart. It crossed that red dotted line. Okay, so the Polish model was used to represent the power flow, and that's what we're looking at on the right. So we were able to initiate a cascading failure resulting in an 86% outage with just 10 bots. 4 bots represented an 85% outage. 15 bots represented tie line failures. And you can see a summary of the results on the right. So just from a 1% demand increase, we saw each one of those vertices represents a node in the power system. And we saw significant disruption in power. In fact, you can see kind of a cascading failure there because each color represents the step at which it began to experience a failure. So number 1 would be the initial attack, things that occurred immediately. Those are the darker lines there. They might be a little difficult to see. And then all the way up to yellow, that would be after 5 previous failures, that's when the final failure occurred. In this case, there were 5 waves of failures. So that's a good example of a cascading failure where one group of failures results in even more. All right, so from just a 10% demand increase, we saw a much larger cascading failure. In fact, that is almost an entire blackout. That is almost every node in the power line going down. As you can see, a lot of them were actually occurring very early on. There aren't very many colored lines in there. So we see a very large propagation. Okay, so an attack on increasing operating costs was also simulated. This is not a very difficult thing to see. The main thing that should be observed here is that when there was no adversary in the system, the operation cost increased linearly when compared to the power demand increase, that's as you would expect. But when a mad IoT event occurred, you see a exponential increase in the cost related to the power demand. And that's quite significant. That's because the expectations of demand were exceeded. And in this case, power cost would go up because, again, they'd have to purchase power from emergency firms that specialize in emergency power generation. Of course, it would be purchased at a premium. So what can we do? What can we do to guard against this? Well, the first thing you should do is throw out the old rule book of how power grids should be guarded against unexpected events, because in the past it was not very feasible for people to launch a wide-scale attack on a power grid unless it was a military state perhaps. But now, with the advent of botnets, especially botnets using IoT devices that draw a lot of power, we need to start thinking about that when we design power grid protocols and mitigations. And some things we can build into the operation of power grids to guard against this is you want to just do some simple things like increase the reserve capacity. So if you have a large number of IoT devices connected to the grid and you take a survey of that, you need to know that in the event of an attack, you'll be able to sustain power stability. And in addition, you want to make sure your line capacity can also compensate for that increase in power demand, because although you may be able to generate enough electricity, if your power lines cannot transmit it, then you're going to end up having line failures and perhaps even cascading failures. Now, the IoT side is much more challenging, and in fact, it is out of scope of this paper in particular. But in summary, any devices that are connected to a home network are vulnerable. That's because home networks generally, end users aren't going to spend a lot of time securing them. So the IoT devices themselves need to have security in mind when they're developed. So these security measures need to be developed with the possibility of a home network being compromised in mind. And of course, there's a whole field of research going on with regard to IoT security, but putting those in place definitely reduces the feasibility that a botnet could be created, and therefore reduces the feasibility that a mad IoT attack could even be executed. So, in conclusion, an adversary can utilize high wattage IoT devices to attack the power grid. A new class of attacks called manipulation of demand via IoT was proposed in this paper, MAD IoT, so we've been talking about, and the implications of such an attack were simulated and shown to be significant from the graphs that we saw. Power systems need to be designed and operated in a way that addresses the threat of a MAD IoT attack, and IoT security needs to be improved to reduce the risk of an attack. All right, thank you.